Okay, so it took us a long time to set up, but we're ready. Easthampton Community Television is taping it, and we're taping it for my own good too. But look at that wonderful topic. And what does it mean? I'm going to talk about all the possible places a person from Southampton could have been buried through the 250 years of Southampton. What if you're a Catholic in Southampton? Could you be buried in Southampton? No, right? And same with Jewish people. So I'll talk about the most likely cemeteries they might have been placed into. And we do have some beautiful cemeteries. In fact, there's 3 of them in town. One is very easy to find, one's slightly more difficult to find, and one's almost impossible to find. Right? I know of only one lost cemetery in the Connecticut River Valley, and that's in Easthampton. And that's a lot of cemeteries. I've been to about 200 cemeteries throughout the valley, and I've been doing this for 11 years. And so, let's go on, and happy birthday to the town.
Thank you.
Okay. This is one of the many people buried in the town, and we're going to talk about what the stones look like now in their positions. So I'm going to tell you how a person should have been buried along the way and what you find out there now. And most people find this very peculiar that there is a difference. Now, most people will find this very useful from the genealogy point of view. Okay, next slide. Next slide. And like she mentioned, I belong to the Holy Preservation Trust, and for 11 years now, they've supported me a bit financially, mostly by coming out to my presentations and my tours and helping me out when needed. Then they have an annual garden show and art show, and they're having one next year on a Revolutionary War theme. All right, next slide. And I have private sponsors. These are them. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pass out a sheet for you. And this is going to have information about this presentation today, and also have a schedule on the back. And then my helper is going to pass out the business card. Put it down. Okay. And if you can share these if possible. Hello.
Thank you very much.
There you go. Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Can you pass one to the person behind you? Okay. You all set? Okay. So on this sheet, you see the particulars I have to talk about today. The particulars include who sponsored this. Now, most importantly, the major sponsor is the Southampton Local Cultural Council, which is part of the Massachusetts Cultural Council. All right, and these are the private sponsors. Okay, next slide. All right, and thanks to the host, and again, happy birthday to the whole town. And next slide. All right, and what I do was mentioned. I go around to a lot of topics every year in a lot of communities. This year happens to be 13 communities. Next year, I hope I increase it once more. I might have started with 2 communities 10 years ago, but I increase every year. And it gets easier for me because once you see a certain connection between what a park might look like or canal is all about, then you start to see the pattern behind them. All right, next slide. And the business card was passed out to you, so you can always use that. And I give a lot of canal tours, and those are my most popular by far. Southampton, once upon a time, did have a canal. It's gone. There are lots of canals in the Connecticut River Valley. In fact, I went about counting them up on old maps, and I came up to 80 canals just in the 3 counties of the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts. That's a lot of canals. Most were power canals. Now, every year also as I do this, I have a new charity. And the charity this year is very important because 150 years ago in Holyoke, there was a wooden church. On May 27th of 1875, that wooden church with 600 people inside burned to the ground. In 10 minutes, the church was gone, and 70 people lost their lives. It was a year after the Williamsburg had a dam collapse, and 183 people died. So there's a lot of bad luck back then, or they really needed to design things better, is more like it. But 150 years later, that block is still used for a religious institution. The church is gone, but the Sisters of Providence changed over the whole city block into what's called Providence Ministries. And they have like Kate's Kitchen there, which is a free lunch and supper. And they have homes for men that are addicts. And if you have, electronically, if you have $5 or $10 to spare, then I hope you can send them money. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about all religious groups and one extra, the Native Americans. And this, along the way, you can always raise your hand because it's sometimes I don't always know where things are. It's very hard to get every detail about a community correct. This is not in Southampton. This is in Northampton. This was when you go to St. Mary's Cemetery. And when we start to talk about the Catholics, we're going to mention St. Mary's Cemetery because a lot of the Catholics of Southampton would have been buried there, but they also were buried other places. This happens to be the founder of, I think, 6 major Catholic churches around Hampshire County. And he's buried in that cemetery. But one of the biggest mysteries to me, his burial record said he's buried out in Hancock, Massachusetts. And yet, his stone is here. Next slide. All right, and another big mystery we're going to try to solve today is there's a 3rd cemetery in Southampton. And I want to know where it is someday and go there and take pictures of the headstones. I know it exists because in 1935, a person named Walter Corbin went around the Connecticut River Valley. He did genealogy for people. He also wrote down inscriptions of as many headstones as he could find. And he did the 2 major cemeteries in Southampton. He did this one too. This was a burial site, and he tells you right inside of this where it is located. But I can't find it, and I tried very hard. I probably tried at least 2 hours looking around the different directions he's given, and it's tough. Other people think on the internet they know where it is, and I tried those places. I just cannot find it. So we're going to come back to this slide. Look what he did in 1930, and he's a very accurate person. I've used a lot of his works, and his work is now on the internet, but where is his cemetery? Okay, next slide. All right, now these are different types of cemeteries that can exist in the United States. All right, so this is general. We're going to get very specific very soon. The oldest type and the most common type for Protestants of the Churchyard Cemetery and the Southampton Center Cemetery definitely is that. You don't have to put the cemetery right next to the church, although a lot of places do. All right, for instance, in Pelham, the cemetery is right next to the old churchyard, and that's where the word came around. But you can be up to half mile or a mile away, and it's still considered churchyard because the church owns it. And you know that the churchyard cemetery here is about half mile away. Right? There's also a family-style cemetery where only one family is buried there, and a lot of communities would have those. There's also a neighborhood. Southampton happens to have one neighborhood cemetery. They became much more prevalent after the Revolutionary War because there was a lot of freedom to open up and do things differently. All right, and all the Catholic ones I'll talk about and Jewish are on a lawn style. These are very scattered and look, except the gravestones always point on the east-west axis. And the same with family. With neighborhood cemeteries, the same thing. There's always an east-west axis, but the plots could be scattered around. So you might have a husband and wife team close together, but a lot of their children, even young ones, would be somewhere else. The superintendent of the cemetery, would only leave a couple spaces for a married couple, and he was the one that would give out the plot because the plot was free if you belonged to the church. Okay, so next slide.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You know the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery?
A graveyard is a very generic term, and most people would only apply it to churchyard cemeteries. It's the old brownstone look, but it's so general that there's no specific thing to it.
I've heard that it was, when it's by the church, it's called a graveyard.
Usually when it's right by a church, you call it the churchyard cemetery, right? So, but it's such a nice general term, you can use it almost anywhere. And notice that I use burial grounds as an even more general term. All right, now, there's a gap of a few years between the settlers coming to Southampton. They had to get permission to move out here and take in land. And they did so. But of course, those settlers are from Northampton, which was settled very early on in 1630, I believe. Springfield was 1630. I think Northampton would have been a year or two later. All right. Now, in Northampton, it used to be a cemetery older than the Bridge Street Cemetery. It was where the courthouse is nowadays. But very early on, they moved it into the Bridge Street Cemetery. Are there any of the original pioneers of Southampton in the Bridge Street Cemetery? Because there was a gap between the first settler coming here and the first cemetery opening up. All right, next slide. All right, so this cemetery started in 1738. Southampton was partitioned in 1732 for the first pioneers. If anyone died in the first 6 years, where were they brought? My theory is that they probably were brought to the Bridge Street Cemetery. But there were so few people, pioneers, it might be true there was no adults that died in that 6-year gap. But children had such a hard time in the first couple of years of life. The birth rate was very hard, but the death rate was incredibly high for children. And so were there any children in the 6-year gap? Probably. And they would have had to have been brought to a cemetery. You had to get a death certificate from the church, and then they would have done something about it. Now, there was no church yet in Southampton. So probably they were brought to the Congregational Church of Northampton and buried in Bridge Street. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is how people would have been buried. In Southampton, 1738, up to 1776. Recognize that year, a new country comes around. Very important. When you have the ability to do things the way you want to, you're going to do that in a way that your new philosophy tells you or awakens you towards. All right, now this stone is not in Southampton because I've looked through all the cemeteries in Southampton, and you're supposed to have a certain arrangement between the headstone and the footstone, and they're supposed to point in a certain direction. And this gives you the idea. This headstone, the larger of the two, and this is the footstone behind, this happens to be in Palmer. Right, notice the inscription on this headstone. If you could read this footstone, the inscription would point in the other direction. So they never point towards each other on a correct arrangement of stones. In between, you put the body. The head goes where the headstone of the person is. The footstone goes where the feet of the person is. They leave 2 feet in front, and they leave 2 feet behind the footstone. The people that come to visit the deceased walk in those 2-foot paths, either by the footstone or headstone. And then they read, and then they realize their deceased member of the family is right here. There was a taboo up until about 1830s to step on the ground of a deceased person, whether it was your family member or not. So they had to go in these 2-foot gaps in front and behind the stones. So here, you would have come up this aisle and been able to read the full inscription on the headstone. And these very old burials, of course, you always put the person on a perfect east-west axis. Now, it just so happens that both major cemeteries in Southampton are already very close to being on the east-west axis. If you look at the roads they're on, they're already lined up very much on the east-west axis already. Okay, but these old burials would have been the following. The head of the person would have been towards the east, the feet of the person towards the west. The footstone here, inscription out. Headstone here, inscription out. So if you're walking in these 2 aisles, you could read both. Right? You can actually send 2 family members down looking, and you have a better chance because you see the footstone with the initials and say, oh, it's here. So this is the way people were buried. Why? On Resurrection Day, the Protestants very much believed the Resurrection Day would happen, and it would happen in a certain direction, that it would happen in the east, where the sun rises. On the Resurrection Day, a person is thought to, according to theology, have their upper torso rise upwards. If this person rises upwards on the Resurrection Day, what direction are they going to look? West. Now, the resurrection happens in east. The Protestants thought from 1620, when they settled the United States, up to 1776, that you were not worthy to see the resurrection day. You were a sinner, and I'll tell you the most famous phrase around this area of any minister, you are the sinner in the hands of an angry God. That was by Jonathan Edwards of Northampton. Thus, in burial terms, you could not look towards the east on Resurrection Day. You were not worthy of it. In 1776, that would change because you had a new country, a new philosophy. All right? I have such a hard time finding a perfect arrangement. East-west axis, 2 stones, both pointing out. You know how hard that is to find? Well, I'll tell you. I've visited 200 cemeteries in these 2 counties. I've looked for this arrangement for about 30 years. I didn't find my first correct arrangement until this year. That's 29 years of looking and nothing. And then all of a sudden, in 1 week, only 1 week, I finally found 18 examples, 12 of them at the Palmer Center Cemetery. Why? Because it's so remote. It seems like it should be downtown, Palmer Center Cemetery. It's not, because Palmer has a lot of villages and nothing's in the center. So Palmer Center Cemetery is so remote that it's hard to find even when people tell you the address. And then, even then, you got to walk a quarter mile into the cemetery. And thus, no one's changed it around. And thus, it's one of the few cemeteries where stones are still in the original direction. Okay, so next slide. Okay, new country, 1776, you sign the Declaration of Independence. You claim you're independent from the United Kingdom. Of course, you're not until you win that war, but we thought so much that we were that we changed all our state constitutions. The states had their constitutions before the federal government had theirs. Also, burial practice changed, religion changed, right? And you would have different philosophy, a different style of ministers. You were now worthy to see the resurrection on the day. You would now, if you raised up torso, upper torso upwards, you would now face towards the east. From 1776 onwards, the correct arrangement of stones is such. The headstone back here, the footstone over here. Pointing out, pointing out. So the inscription's still going outwards, body in the middle. You still have your 2-foot aisles. And this was good up to 1831 until the next drastic change comes around. If you go into cemeteries, though, you don't see that. In fact, I'll give you a good example. Go into the big cemetery of this town, the Southampton Center Cemetery. Do you find all pre-1831 stones pointing towards, inscription towards the west? No, when you go in that cemetery, almost all the old stones point to the east. So something's happened again. And that means someone's changed those stones around. And how many footstones are in that cemetery? I counted, I think, 3. And yet they all had them at one time. Yes?
Many of the footstones were removed due to maintenance. And
Yes.
we have them at Park Chapman House.
That's wonderful. Now, you might be tempted to put them back in the original way. If they ever go back, which would be wonderful, they were always put the height of the length of the coffin. So if you have a 5-year-old child, they were put about this much. If it was a 6-foot guy in a coffin, very large, it was put like 7 feet away. So temptation put them back in that way, but no, for maintenance reasons, maybe go about 2 feet away from the other stones. But that would be nice. In 1831 is a big change, and everything drastically changes. And that drastic change was a new style of relationship to religion, and a new forms of philosophy come mostly to Massachusetts. And the first cemetery in the United States to make use of that philosophy was the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Watertown in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They made a cemetery where there's no east-west axis of the burials. There's no arrangement of the stones at all. You can put them any direction, and there's no more footstones. You put them any directions relative to the roads, too. So you could have one here and another one 10 feet away pointing 90 degrees in another direction. Because of the terrain changes, the road changes, or they just have a nice garden portion right there. It's called a garden-style cemetery or a rural cemetery. It's absolutely beautiful in that cemetery. If you've never been to that cemetery, try to go there. It's absolutely gorgeous. The whole park movement across the United States started because of that cemetery. But no longer do you have east-west axis. And superintendents of cemeteries would start to make use of that and start pointing burials towards an interior roadway or towards the exterior road. And from that point, gradually, you lose that axis. Now, you're going to find a lot of stones still take on that axis. The reason why the superintendent would see the lines and keep burying in it. So it kept that way for a very long time. But from that point, you can do whatever you want to. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I've marked off where the Southampton Center Cemetery is. The church is right over here. Okay, the cemetery has grown a great deal through the ages. and it's grown always from its original site towards the right. So if you face into the cemetery, it's always grown towards the right. Okay, next slide. All right, and this is the church it belongs to, but even this church was moved. You might know that. It used to be lower down. It was moved up. All right, next slide. So this is Walter Corbin's map of the cemetery in 1930. The numbers, I think still apply. It's a bigger cemetery now. Look at the east-west axis, and that's why if you go up to the stones, you might think that the stones point on the roadway, towards the roadway, for the very old ones. A lot of them do, but you'll find once in a while the very old ones point on a very slightly different axis, because east is not absolutely perpendicular to the road. All right, so there's a little difference here. All right, next slide. And this is the first burial. Now, it says he died because he drank too much cold water. It is possible to die from drinking too much water. In fact, the person in the United States died that way last year. I don't know if the cold matters. Maybe it does. But just drinking too much water after you're dehydrated could kill you. So he probably did die this way, right? But supposedly this is the birth of the cemetery. Whether the deed of land matches that, I don't know. The real stone is back here, and this one was put in much, much later. Yes, go ahead.
I can't see the date from here.
It says 1738. Okay, and I think his father lived in Northampton, and he had walked over to Southampton, the legend goes, and he was dehydrated. All right, next slide. All right, so American Revolutionary War comes around, and we're celebrating the start of it this year. All right, Aaron Strong died at Saratoga, probably the most important battle of the entire Revolutionary War. This is the first time that the Patriots really, for sure, got a victory over the British for the first time ever. Lexington and Concord, they did very well, right? At Bunker Hill, it's officially a defeat, but the British had a lot of injuries and death. But no one calls those victories. They might have been philosophical victories, but this was for sure. And Aaron Strong was at that location. Okay, now, it has a very peculiar message down here written by Walter Corbin. It says that, very strangely, his daughter's name is down here, and it says that she's a certain age, I think it's 30 years, no, 25 years old. Now, he did the math, and he came up that she must have been born a couple of years after her father died. Impossible if that's her father. But in reality, what really happens, she was probably a lot older than 25. She's probably 27 years old. And the stone just put the wrong age. Now, you have a brownstone. Where did that brownstone come from? Close, very close. Almost all brownstones, whether they're in church architecture or in cemeteries, come from Longmeadow. In fact, even more specific, they came from East Longmeadow, right? There was 19 brownstone mines, and these brownstones were so inexpensive, they fill the cemeteries of the Connecticut River Valley. And a lot of them have carvers. And there are people that specialize in figuring out who made each one of these by looking at the text they designed. Okay, next slide. All right, the first minister in town, he was a minister for 60 years, Jonathan Judd. He and his wife are buried in this first table gravestone. His son is buried in the next one along. Right? And you always put 5 legs underneath them, and you shape the legs in the same fashion. Now, when his son did it, you can see the son's legs of the table gravestone are different, right? But they're made out of the same material, limestone. And if you point limestone upwards, it's catching a lot of rainwater. And after more than 200 years of being out there, what has happened is it's so hard to read. There's so much text on this. You would love to read it, but it's almost impossible to read at this point. And his house is still around?
Several years ago, the Congregational Church paid, and it's now been re-engraved.
Re-engraved.
So it is much,
So it's easier.
yeah, easier to read.
Okay. Do you have a typewritten copy of it somewhere?
Not
Okay.
that I know of.
All right. Because I wish to put it up somewhere on the internet so people could see it. All right, next slide. And this is his house, and I believe it's still there, right? 200 plus years later. All right, next slide. All right, so I told you I think there's 3 footstones left in that cemetery. And this happens to be one of them, all right? You can see the headstones here, and the footstone is there. Okay, now, the footstone is pointing towards the roadway. The headstone's pointing towards the roadway, inscriptions. So is this a correct arrangement here? No, because they have to point opposite each other, right? And she died about 1810. So where is her body pointing? It would be she wants to rise towards the east, so her head is truly here, and her feet are here. So, out of the 2, which stone is correct? The headstone or in terms of arrangement or orientation? The footstone is the one that's correct. The headstone is wrong. What has happened to almost every Protestant cemetery in New England is that it went through a movement called the American Cemetery Beautification Movement from 1880 to 1910s. And what happens is entire cemeteries were lifted up and moved to another part of the town or into another cemetery. That happened in Springfield, Chicopee, South Hadley, Northampton. And it happens a lot. And so these cemeteries that were downtown were moved. Southampton never moved any of their cemeteries. But what also happened during that movement was that people said, we should have all the stones pointing towards the roadway. Whether they were the ancient ones pre-Revolutionary War or not. Now, the ones before the Revolutionary War in Southampton, they would have had inscriptions pointing towards the roadway already because the headstone would be pointing outwards towards the east, footstones towards the west, body rise towards the west, on the very old ones. There are stones were already pointing towards the roadway. But what someone did, a superintendent from 1880 to 1910s, he took all the burials from 1776 up to whenever they stopped these orientations, 1830s, and he or she shifted them 180 degrees to point towards the roadway. So this used to point the other way. So I went to the Southampton Cemetery. I tried to figure out how many would fit in that time range. I would guess at least 100 and maybe 200 were shifted. So over a course of many years, with helpers, they would lift these things up, shift them around, just because they thought that was beautiful. So these old cemeteries everywhere were shifted around. So when you go in, you're not seeing the original cemetery look anymore. A lot of footstones gone, a lot of headstones shifted around. All right, now, next slide. And if you know the cemetery, you know there's a hole in tomb. This one was made 1874. The one in Amherst says 1840s. I hear this, some in Sunderland and Shrewsbury, 1830s. And supposedly there's one left in the Connecticut River Valley in Sunderland. You can see the date. What was it for? During the winter, you couldn't bury people because The ground's too hard. And it was always that way until about 1920 when they finally got equipment to thaw out the ground. And when they did, these became obsolete. This one happens to be around still, 151 years later. Great. You store the bodies there until April and then bury them. In Southampton, you didn't need a big one. If you go to Springfield, these old tombs are enormous. And a lot of times, in Springfield's case, at Oak Grove Cemetery, they changed the old tomb into a chapel with a new facade on it. So when you go into the chapel there, you're inside an old tomb. So they found uses for these. Also, a lot of towns bought a carriage that was only for burials. It was called a hearse carriage. And I'm pretty sure Southampton would have had one. They would have saved on money by having their own. Remember, there's no motor-driven hearses till about 1920 or so. So you would have had a hearse, and a lot of times they would have put them right next to these tombs. All right? In some communities, you can still see the foundations. Others, you still have the hearse houses around. All right, next slide. Now, what is this fence doing around? Now, I've only seen, of all these cemeteries you've gone to, I've only seen 2 that were made to control the grave robbers. There is one of these on Emily Dickinson's cemetery, in the West Cemetery in Amherst, but I think it was put there because she's so famous. They put it up to control people going in to destroy her tombstone. But there are 2 made to thwart grave robbers. One is in Chicopee at the Maple Grove Cemetery. It is quite a sight because the child who was buried there was 10 years old, and so they put the fence very close to the burial. So it's only about this wide and so forth. And it's about 4 feet high. They're trying to keep the grave robbers out. Now, you need to have a medical school nearby. Is there a medical school anywhere near Southampton? Well, nowadays you find them Boston, Worcester, Providence, Hartford, Farmington, Albany, Burlington, and there's one New Hampshire. That's far away. So what are you doing making a fence around this to keep the grave robbers away? My best guess is that one of the most famous people of Southampton, we're going to come with him very quickly, he was a medical doctor, and he went to a medical school I didn't mention. It was in Pittsfield. It's called the Berkshire Medical School. And he probably told his family when they started burying people here, oh, I remember the day that we used to steal bodies. And he probably got them afraid. But you have something special, one of 2 that I found in the Connecticut Valley. And it used to have a gate that would lock. On the one in Chicopee, they had a place to put lanterns on the very top, and at night they'd light them. You'd only have to keep watch for about a month. After 4 weeks, the body would be decomposed enough that the medical school did not want it. But grave robbers were a horrible problem around big cities, but they did us a great favor. What great favor could a grave robber ever do you? Well, it was taboo to dissect human bodies in order to study medicine. It still was a taboo up until the 1890s. And at that point, they finally passed laws to allow it. But before that, from about 1800 to 1890, you needed a body to dissect. And if you're going to be a good medical student, and medicine and science advanced so much in the 1800s that they wanted to cut up these bodies, and each medical student should have one. So a lot of cemeteries around the big cities were being robbed of bodies, but they were doing us a good favor. When they found most bodies and they brought it to a medical school, the president of the medical school was the one to take in the body. That's how serious they took the whole thing. And they would pay people about $60 to $80, right? Except when it was a pregnant woman. And why that? Because How difficult is it to find a pregnant woman who dies with the baby still inside of her and use it for dissection? And how valuable is that information? It's incredibly valuable. In 1850s money, pregnant women who died and were robbed would get $2,000 in 1850 money. That is the equivalent of maybe $60,000 these medical schools pay out because of the value of that information. Okay, next slide. Okay, you've probably seen this stone. It's a monument put after the Civil War, and it has the names of the men from Southampton who went off to war and died because of the war due to illness or injuries. Some went off to the war from Southampton, but were residents of other communities, but joined a militia that was based in Southampton too. So their names are on here on 4 sides. Beautiful. In most cases, the person is not buried here, except a few cases. Okay, so I was able to find a few cases where the body was taken back. In most cases, as you can imagine, that would be very difficult. Most cases, they were taken back. The person went to a hospital, either in District of Columbia or even in New England somewhere, and then they brought them back to Southampton. All right, next slide. Okay, all the other war memorials of Southampton are on the green out here. That's very close by. So every war is honored with their dead. All right? So the reason I'm showing you this is that the Civil War one I don't think is anywhere in this green because they know very well that it's in the cemetery. Okay, next slide. Okay, so look at this. Perry Coleman died 1862. He died in Fair Oaks, Virginia. And it says over here, now I could not find a way of making that bigger. These old sheets would have 30 different burial informations and lines on them. And so it's already at a very low level of handwriting. And when you digitize it, it doesn't really get much better. But it says in the very last column that he died and was buried on the battlefield of Fair Oaks. Then it says underneath, they brought him, they took him up, disinterred him, reinterred him in Southampton. So that's an incredible amount of information they put. In most cases, there was a lot of men from Southampton that died in the war. In most cases, they would bury him on site. Okay, so next slide. And this is his stone. And a relative added this later. He has a gorgeous stone. And that's one of the few pictures I could find of anyone from Southampton that died in the Civil War. I found it on the internet. It's a beautiful slide. A lot of men that went off to the Civil War had their picture taken before they went. Photography was all the rage in the 60s. And so you have a lot of these, right? And Ken Burns has made a living off of a lot of these old photographs. Okay, next slide. Now, Rufus Robinson, not so lucky. He died in the Andersonville Cemetery. Oh, he died, Andersonville, which is a prisoner of war camp in Georgia. And he died without a stone. The Confederate did not bother to feed these men very much. When diseases started to hit, such as diphtheria and cholera, they did nothing about it. So the Northern forces, when they had prisoners of war, treated them very well. The Southern forces, when they had prisoners of war, treated them very badly. And here's his number, that because there was, in this cemetery that he's in, there was an old plat map, and someone had put the numbers and matched to the names, but there was no stones until the federal government started putting these up about 1900. All right, so he's buried down there, and everyone that died in Annisville is buried there. From Southampton, I believe there's 5 men that are buried in this cemetery. Okay, next slide. Now, Rufus Street, it says Cenotaph. Cenotaph is when you have an inscription in a cemetery where you're not buried in that cemetery. So if you look through the Southampton Cemetery, you'll find a stone put up for Rufus Street. If you read, he's buried in New Orleans, all right? And was he ever disinterred and reinterred? Yes, but he was not brought back to Southampton. Okay, so next slide. Where was he brought? Well, he might have been buried in the original location, in Cypress Grove number 2 cemetery. All right, and look what Walter Corbin has done, got the inscription on that. It's very hard to read that stone, but on the stone, someone put down where he was buried. Ian put a stone up for him in Southampton. He's not buried there. A cenotaph. But in the 1920s, all the people buried in this cemetery, they took up out of the ground and put them in another cemetery. The reason why was this cemetery was for both the Northern forces and the Southern forces together. And the federal government decided to get a national cemetery going for just the Northern forces and leave the Southern ones there and make that cemetery better. So they're both separate now. Okay, next slide. All right, now I know Southampton has Community Preservation Act, and I know they do a lot with it. But if you walk through the cemetery, every winter things get destroyed and damaged. So I found this on the ground. I have no clue how the arrangement of this with the Bartlett stone was, but there's a big gravestone cylinder on the ground. And cemeteries are eligible for Community Preservation Act grants. You know, a few $1,000s every 5 years would fix these cemeteries up very, very nicely. Some stones are in the ground. The reason why, you know, the thawed ground's pushing things over, especially when the ground's not leveled. But for the most part, this cemetery is a gorgeous cemetery. A lot of positives behind it, and it's well taken care of. All right, next slide. Okay, now this Gridley Cemetery, and this is trying to tell you where it is. And I've tried, like I told you, 3 different places. Right next to the church, there's a home, and then there's a mechanic shop. I thought that was one of the places. So I go up to the back fence, look down, I can't find stones. I know their stones should be still there, because in 1930, Walter Corbin said they were there. He also says here they're on the old Ridley place, which is right there, a little further up from the church. I tried that home and couldn't see anything. I walked up this street up here to check this home, and there might be something back there, but I can't walk on private property. Now, I was just starting to think yesterday, this thought, could he be buried on the other Gridley home of Southampton? The son. Could that son have the burials of his parents and his brothers and sisters on his property? The Gridley home is that in private hands. It's at a home that's only about 5 homes up from here. I'll show you the picture of it soon. He writes down it's also in 1930 at the Mrs. Abner Peck home. And I tried the 1930 census, and I put in Abner Peck, and I couldn't find his widow. Okay, so next slide. All right, and this is the Gridley homestead on College Highway. All right, it's still there. So I checked the back as best I could. I couldn't see anything from all different angles. Okay, next slide. And this.
The house ended up having a pool, so at one point.
They might have moved it. Now,
That's there that you just showed is the one that's right next to the church. And
Yes.
that was a boarding house. The
Yes.
cemetery you're talking about is across from the gas station.
Yeah.
In the small engine repair place, it's in his back lot. He has that all blocked off, so you can't get in there unless you ask for his permission.
Oh, so he might grant that.
Yes.
Okay.
Knowing that what you do with your business.
Yes, yes.
He may say, yeah, come on with me.
Okay, that'd be wonderful. There's a site called findagrave.com that you put up burial pictures, stones, of course. No one in the 30 years existence of Find a Grave has gone in there. People have taken the information on the cards that Walter Corbin had because he went up to the stones, and people have put those up. This is what Walter Corbin made, so if you look at that place, this is what it should look like. 9 burials, and he told which was which. The parents of Josiah Gridley are over here, another family here, some of his brothers and sisters over here, and a granddaughter of the whole family is over here. But I want pictures of the 9 stones, and they should exist. And they do exist, I hope. Okay, next slide. And this is Josiah Gridley. He was a medical doctor. He is buried in the Southampton Center Cemetery. Right? He is a son of the people that started the other cemetery, who was Lemon and Lois Gridley. He's here with 3 wives. 2 of them died before him, 1 died after him. This stone is a type of stone that was only available from about the 1880s onwards, so I know it's not the original stone for him. Josiah Gridley died 1876. This stone was from 1880s up to 19-teens. It was available, so it's a stone that was put up later. This stone is a Sears Roebuck gravestone. You would buy it out of the Sears Roebuck catalog. And this is he. Now, if he stayed just being a medical doctor, it would have been great, but he did other things. He wrote books, and next slide. Right, this is his house, still there, right? All right, 19 East Street. He wrote a cool book, Astounding Facts from the Spirit World. I don't know if it still exists, but he was a spiritualist also, besides being a medical doctor. When his son died, I think his son was very young, he got very upset, and he went beyond the knowledge that medicine would give you, trying to communicate with his son through spiritualism. He claimed he succeeded. He would go to tables filled with relatives, and they would try to connect. He also did herbalism. And in the 1800s, who knows if the herbs are working? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's always good to experiment, especially early on in medicine. All right, next slide. And there he is with his family. Great picture. Next slide. Okay, so Westport Cemetery, it's out there. If you go out onto the road is dirt road, former road, dirt road about half the time, and dirt and paved about half the time. I've been there 3 times. There's a reservoir there now owned by Holyoke. In fact, about 20% of Southampton is under deed to Holyoke. The Holyoke Waterworks owned it, and they very, very nicely went around to people in the 1800s and asked them, can we buy your land and home this year? We'll pay above the market rate. They finally started having success by the 1870s because farmers were moving out to the Midwest anyways. And so they started buying up a lot of land at that point. They figured out that the cemetery and one house were not in the watershed of the reservoir that they would build. And so they left it there. So that cemetery and that one house, a Clark house, is still out there. The water that goes on that ground does not go into that reservoir. Nowadays, it's called Ty-Carmody. It used to be called the Manhan. And there's another reservoir up here called the White Reservoir, and there's a tiny reservoir called the Intake Reservoir next to it. Okay, next slide. And this is showing you where it is. And the next slide. And this is a picture of the Ty Carmody or the Fulmer Reservoir or the Manhan Reservoir. They're not all one and the same. The Ty Carmody is enormous compared to the Fulmer Reservoir or the Manhan Reservoir. It's quite enormous. No one can go out there, sadly. Okay, next slide. But this is the entrance to the West Part Cemetery. And next slide. And there's a slope, and that's a fixed up slope. So that's not the original way it was. It was gradual down, but they fixed it up to support it so that the land would not collapse down towards the road. So these came much later. And then the burials start up here. I do not know if Holyoke was the one to do that. Maybe they did. All right, next slide. Okay, now if you go in there, all the stones point towards the road. All the stones point towards the east. So there are some very old stones in there. And there's none older than Revolutionary War, though. So they should be on the east-west axis from 1776 up until the 1830s. There are many burials from that time. And if you do it right, those old burials should point towards the west, but they don't. So superintendents of cemeteries of Southampton has changed these two. And there are a few more footstones. Headstone, footstone off to the side. No, it should be over here. We know that. Point outwards, and this should point the other direction. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of probably the most famous person out there is Samuel Burt. He was the first settler out there. And he was a deacon. He was also in the Revolutionary War. And there's 3 more Revolutionary War veterans out there. So next slide. And these are the 3, Avery, Ransford Avery, Gad Pomeroy, and Isaac Parsons, all Revolutionary War veterans. Okay, and the next slide. And the last burial was in 1909. No stone, so no one knows when the last burial was, except by death records. Beautiful death records by 1904, a lot bigger than the pre-1904. West Part Cemetery, that's the last time you'll ever see anyone buried in the West Part Cemetery, 1904. And it says right on the card. Okay, next slide. Now, what about the Catholics? No Catholic cemetery around. When was the first one in Western Massachusetts? The first one in all of Western New England is in Springfield. It's called the St. Matthew's Cemetery on the Chicopee border. Started in 1845. If you have good eyes, you can see a lot of open space, hardly any stones. In 1848, in Holyoke, there was a cholera epidemic. The Irish had left the famine, 1848, went to Holyoke for jobs. They were living out in the open because there was no houses there yet. Cholera hit. 300 people died in 1 month in Holyoke, and they were buried in here. No stones. So in this cemetery, there are a lot of burials. 5% of them have stones because the Irish were very poor. But if anyone from Southampton died in the early 1840s, they were buried here. They were Catholic. So next slide. But the first Catholic cemetery that was used heavily by people from Southampton was the St. Mary's Cemetery. And it was on King Street of Northampton. But the St. Mary's Cemetery is not on King Street anymore. The St. Mary's Church was also on King Street. King. There's the church, there's the cemetery, there's the rectory. They moved everything when they built the gorgeous St. Mary's Church in Northampton. And so this was the first one. It was the second Catholic cemetery in Western Massachusetts. It was the second church for Catholics in Western Massachusetts, too. They moved it in the 1870s out to the beautiful St. Mary's Cemetery. Were there people from Southampton buried there? Of course, because there were Catholics there working the farms mostly, but also as servants in houses. Next slide. And here it is moved. FC, I believe, means Florence Catholic Cemetery because they didn't have a proper name for it yet. Here is the old location still, but they would move that in a few years up to here. Those old burials are next to this dot right here. So they moved about 300 people. All right, next slide. All right, now, once you start going through the death records of Southampton, they don't tell you the death location, the cemetery, until 1904. And so what you have to do is depend upon obituaries to help you out, or try to guess, or, much easier than any of that, on those lines for the death person, at the very end, they don't tell you the cemetery, but they'll tell you the town. And that will help enormously because only a few towns and cities around the Connecticut River Valley had old Catholic cemeteries. So if you're reading the line and you know the St. Mary's in Westfield was made 1862, and you have a person that's an ancestor of yours, and it says buried in Westfield, and you know they're Catholic, they're in the St. Mary's there. All right, so next slide. And St. Jerome's and Hoy, why were they using that? Easy. Because a lot of people started flooding, a lot of Catholics started flooding into Southampton by 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, not to get mill jobs, but to take on farm jobs and servant jobs. So not everyone, a lot of Catholics worked in the mills of Holyoke and Chicopee, but not everyone did. Others preferred farms and being servants. And so I've seen plenty of Southampton people, even after 1900, buried in the cemetery because their roots came from Holyoke. Their parents might have gone there, and then 20 years later, they decide to go out to Southampton and work on the farms. Next slide. St. Bridget's Cemetery is found very, very often too. It came around 1884. All these cemeteries I've talked about, I think it's 4 Catholic ones, they're all catered to Irish, but a lot of these towns and cities did not have ethnic cemeteries until the 1890s, and so you would have Polish people buried in the St. Bridget's Cemetery, typically thought of being Irish. All right, next slide. So you run into situations like this. Bridget Kane, born in Ireland, died 1860 in Southampton. All right, at the very end, it tells you she's buried in Holyoke. Now, St. Jerome's Cemetery was not ready until 1866, and that's the first Catholic cemetery of Holyoke. So that is impossible. Where is she? She is most likely in the Calvary Cemetery in Chicopee. And the reason why I got confused was that the Calvary Cemetery of Chicopee was a Catholic diocese cemetery for all Catholics who had no set church or thus set cemetery. And she might have not had relatives, and the default case is the Calvary Cemetery. Yes?
Question, what are we looking at? Are they church records and town records?
This is a town record. Towns in Massachusetts had to keep records, birth, marriage, death from 1841 onwards. Before that, it was the churches. And so Bridget Kane, buried in Holyoke, impossible. She's probably buried in the Potter's Field, pauper's grave of Calvary Cemetery in Chicopee. But this one they got it right. Thomas Kane, he died, he was born in Southampton, but he died in Southampton in 1862. And then he said, buried in Chicopee. So that is correct. You'll find a lot of people from Southampton that were Catholics did not on a regular basis go to churches. They're so far away. And they would be buried in the Potter's Field for Catholics, which was the Calvary Cemetery of Chicopee. Okay, next slide. Now the Jewish people had some choices, and I found some Jewish people from Southampton, but the first one I found was like the 19-teens. But easy choices, because they would have gone to synagogue in Northampton, one synagogue there. The next nearest synagogue was Holyoke and Springfield. This cemetery started up 1895, and then the next slide tells you there's another cemetery right next to it. Next, 1906, the Congregation B'nai Israel Cemetery. Okay, so next slide. Now, Native Americans, does anyone know of a Native American found in Southampton? I haven't found one. Why do other communities find them? Holyoke, Westfield, Springfield, West Springfield, South Hadley, Granby, Chicopee. I found loads of them. The second biggest Native American site in New England is in Holyoke, because they were constructing apartments near the canals for canal workers or mill workers. Westfield near a canal. Why did they find them? Because they dug so much through Holyoke to build canals and mills and homes. Same with Springfield, same with Westfield, lots of mills. If you don't dig a lot, you're not going to find Native American burials. So Southampton is not dug very much. Having farmers dig deep in the soil, well, 2 feet deep is not going to do it. Okay, you've got to go down much deeper than that. So, if you ever find one, that'd be great. Granby has found 2 in one location. It was a mother with her child buried together. Okay, next slide. And if you find a burial of a Native American, it's about 5 feet deep. You find the head, you find the upper torso, and you find the legs. Why do you put red like this? Because they were packed with red clay always. Always. So in New England, this is what you do with adult Native Americans. You bury them this way. The biggest grave site for Native Americans is out in eastern Massachusetts, where they found like 190 Native Americans together. They put a rock above it, and this is how they packed them with red clay, always. The children are buried flat, and they're also buried with the implements they had during life, always. So their bow and arrow, right, their clothes would go with them. Okay, next slide. Okay, and that's the last slide. I've taken 71 minutes to do it.